What is the definition of an economy? It's an area of the production, distribution of trade, and consumption of goods and services by different agents. The definition of the word rig is to put in proper order for working or use. The definition of a rigged economy is when the production, distribution, or trade is manipulated in favor of a few people. Americans are used to thinking that their nation is special. In many ways, it is. The U.S. has by far the most Nobel Prize winners, the largest defense expenditures, and the most billionaires. But some examples of American exceptionalism should not make us proud. By most accounts, the U.S. has the highest level of economic inequality among developed countries and has the world's greatest per capita health expenditures, yet the lowest life expectancy among comparable countries. It is also one of few developed countries jostling for the dubious distinction of having the lowest measures of equality of opportunity. The notion of the American dream, that, unlike old Europe, we are a land of opportunity, is part of our essence, yet the numbers say otherwise. The life prospects of a young American depend more on the income and education of his or her parents than almost any other advanced country. When Poor Boy Makes Good anecdotes get passed around the media, that is precisely because such stories are so rare. Things appear to be getting worse, partly as a result of forces such as technology and globalization that seem beyond our control, but most disturbingly because of those within our command. It is not the laws of nature that have led us to this dire situation. It is the laws of humankind. Markets do not exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by rules and regulations, which can be designed to favor one group over another. President Donald Trump was right in saying that the system is rigged by those in the inherited plutocracy of which he himself is a member, and he is making it much, much worse. America has long outdone others in its level of inequality, but in the past 40 years it has reached new heights, whereas the income share of the top 0.1% has more than quadrupled, and that of the top 1% has almost doubled. That of the bottom 90% has declined. Wages at the bottom, adjusted for inflation, are about the same as they were some 60 years ago. In fact, for those with a high school education or less, incomes have fallen over recent decades. Males have been particularly hard hit as the U.S. has moved away from manufacturing industries into an economy based on services. Wealth is even less equally distributed, with just 3 Americans having as much as the bottom 50%, testimony to how much money there is at the top and how little there is at the bottom. Families in the bottom 50% hardly have the cash reserves to meet an emergency. Newspapers are replete with stories of those from whom the breakdown of a car or illness starts a downward spiral from which they never recover. In significant part because of high inequality, U.S. life expectancy, exceptionally low to begin with, is experiencing sustained declines. This in spite of the marvels of medical science, many advances of which occur right here in America, and which are made readily available to the rich. One of the main causes of rising morbidity, the increase in alcoholism, drug overdoses, and suicides, as deaths of despair by those who have given up hope. The number of Americans living in their vehicles due to the price of housing is sharply on the rise, even though the practice remains illegal in many U.S. states. A recent survey by the National Law Center on Homeless and Poverty detailed that the number of laws against sleeping in vehicles has more than doubled over the last 10 years. This fictional narrative may at one time have assuaded the guilt of those at the top and persuaded everyone else to accept this sorry state of affairs. Perhaps the defining moment exposing the lie was the 2008 financial crisis, when the bankers who brought the global economy to the brink of ruin with predatory lending, market manipulation, and various other antisocial practices walked away with millions of dollars in bonuses, just as millions of Americans lost their jobs and homes, and tens of millions more worldwide suffered on their account. Virtually none of these bankers were ever held to account for their misdeeds. The wealth of the plantation owners built on the backs of the slaves at the time of the Civil War. The market value of the slaves in the South was approximately half the region's total wealth, including the value of the land and the physical capital. the factories, and the equipment. The wealth of at least this part of this nation was not based on industry, innovation, and commerce, but rather on exploitation. Today we have replaced this open exploitation with more insidious forms, which have intensified since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 1980s. This exploitation, I will argue, is largely to blame for the escalating inequality in the U.S. Economists have put forward a range of explanations for why inequality has in fact been increasing in many developed countries. Some argue that advances in technology have spurred the demand for skilled labor relative to unskilled labor, thereby depressing the wages of the latter. Yet that alone cannot explain why even skilled labor has done so poorly over the past 2 decades, why average wages have done so badly, and why matters are so much worse in the U.S. than in other developed nations. Changes in technology are global and should affect all advanced economies in the same way. Other economists blame globalization itself, which has weakened the power of workers. Firms can and do more abroad unless demands for higher wages are curtailed. But again, globalization has been integral to all advanced economies. Why is its impact so much worse in the U.S.? The shift from a manufacturing to a service-based economy is partly to blame, and it's extreme. A firm of one person. The service economy is a winner-takes-all system. A movie star makes millions, for example, whereas most actors make a pittance. Overall wages are likely to be far more widely dispersed in a service economy than in one based on manufacturing, so the transition contributes to greater inequality. This fact does not explain, however, why the average wage has not improved for decades. Moreover, the shift to the service sector is happening in most other advanced cities. Why are matters so much worse in the U.S.? An account of how the rules have been shaped must begin with antitrust laws, first enacted 128 years ago in the U.S. to prevent the agglomeration of market power. Their enforcement has weakened at a time when, if anything, the laws themselves should have been strengthened. Technological changes have concentrated market power in the hands of a few global players, in part because of so-called network effects. You are far more likely to join a particular social network or use a certain word processor if everyone you know is already using it. Once established, a firm such as Facebook or Microsoft is hard to dislodge. Moreover, fixed costs such as that of developing a piece of software have increased as compared with marginal cost, that of duplicating software. A new entrant has to bear all these fixed costs up front, and if it doesn't enter, the rich incumbent can respond by lowering prices drastically. The cost of making an additional ebook or photo editing program is essentially zero. Rigged rules also explain why the impact of globalization may have worse in the USA. A concerted attack on unions has almost halved the fraction of unionized workers in the nation to about 11%. Weaker unions provide workers less protection against the efforts of firms to drive down wages or worsen working conditions. Moreover, U.S. investment treaties such as the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement treaties that were sold as a way of preventing foreign countries from discriminating against American firms also protect investors against a tightening of environmental and health regulations abroad. For instance, they enable corporations to sue nations in private international arbitration panels for passing laws that protect citizens and the environment by threatening the multinational company's bottom line. Firms like these provisions, which enhance the credibility of a company's threat to move abroad if workers do not temper their demands. In short, these investment agreements weaken U.S. workers' bargaining power even further. Many other changes to our norms, laws, rules, and regulations have contributed to inequality. Weak corporate governance laws have allowed chief executives in the U.S. to compensate themselves 361 times more than the average worker, far more than in other developed countries. Financial liberalization, the stripping away of regulations designed to prevent the financial sector from imposing harms such as the 2008 economic crisis on the rest of society, has enabled the finance industry to grow in size and profitability and has increased its opportunities to exploit everyone else. Banks routinely indulge in practices that are legal but should not be, such as imposing usurious interest rates on borrowers and exorbitant fees on merchants for credit and debit cards, and creating securities that are designed to fail. They also frequently do things that are illegal, including market manipulation and insider trading. All of this, the financial sector has moved money away from ordinary Americans to rich bankers and the bank's shareholders. This redistribution of wealth is an important contributor to American inequality. Morale is lower in unequal societies, especially when inequality is seen as unjust, and the feeling of being used or cheated leads to lower productivity. When those who run gambling casinos or bankers suffering from moral turpitude make a zillion times more than the scientists and inventors who brought us lasers, transistors, and an understanding of DNA, it is clear that something is wrong. Then again, the children of the rich come to think of themselves as a class apart, entitled to their good fortune, and accordingly more likely to break rules necessary for making society function. All of this contributes to a breakdown of trust, with its attendant impact on social cohesion and economic performance. We have come to the conclusion that there is a deep-rooted problem that has caused this financial mess and wealth inequality, which has also forced millions to find second and third jobs, some having to compromise their morals to put food on the table. This deep-rooted problem is our political system. We can no longer afford to leave the decision-making to the corrupt few. Instead, we the people must implement a system of direct democracy to protect the individuals from these nefarious acts.